Well, I shan't keep you long. I'm delighted to be here for the fourth lecture in the series, and I'm particularly pleased that we have a lady, a woman, to be our fourth lecturer. We have gone from 0% gender to 25% in one go, and I hope that we don't fall below 25% in the future, but it's maybe we'll get up way past 50%. Who knows? And I think it may be tomorrow is International Women's Day, so and it's the 100th anniversary of International Women's Day. I think the first one was called International Working Women's Day, so that's appropriate as well. And the other linkage, I think, which I can mention, is that Monica did her training in the UK, and that's the first time I think we've had a strong link between the lecturer and my home country. I think it's also perhaps interesting that if you look at the events that are taking place around the world to celebrate International Women's Day, on the website, the UK has by far the largest number of events being put on, which I'm not quite sure what to make of this, but it's quite curious about that. The Oxfam connection, as many of you know, I work for Oxfam, and I'm particularly pleased also that Monica's area of interest, because Oxfam tries very hard to mainstream gender issues in its work. In fact, some of you will have heard me say this before, but we do have a strapline, a sort of internal strapline, which is putting poor women at the heart of everything we do. So I'm very pleased to welcome Monica. So thank you.
Thank you. Well, it's an immense pleasure to have Dr. Dasgupta here with us today. Thank you, everyone, for coming to the fourth Doran lecture. Dr. Dasgupta is a senior demographer at the World Bank. She's trained, her PhD from England, from Sussex, is in social anthropology and demography. So she brings, from the onset, an interesting mix, something we haven't had before. And I think as the fourth lecture, this talk is really at a very different level than many of the other lectures. The first lecture was really about the development project itself, a critique by Bill Easterly. We had a lecture about population growth, last year's lecture on food. And today it's about gender, which is, as Alan said, very well timed. Dr. Dasgupta's work, I think, is fascinating. It's a type of work that makes people change directions, make decisions about what they want to study, what they find interesting, what's important. Her work on gender bias in Asia, particularly in India, her earliest work, has been enormously influential in understanding the dynamics of how discrimination occurs, and more importantly, about the conscious action which is part of discrimination. I think her ability to ask keen questions about culture and behavior in India really set the bar in terms of relating important questions and using careful empirical analysis to answer those questions. That's also at the same time both richly contextualized. Her work has been cited in very important ways. I think some of the earliest, Amartya Sen's early work in the New York Review of Books, which really popularized the concept of the 100 million missing women, a fantastic piece in and of itself, was based on actual research done by others, including Monica Dasgupta's work. She's going to talk a lot more about her work in much better ways, so I'm not going to go into it. But I think this is just a great example of how empirical analysis, richly contextualized work, a solid understanding of culture can come together. And it's also her recent, anybody who's followed her recent exchange with an economist, Emily Oster, well, as a demographer, she just makes us proud. We got 2 good points there scored. I think there was a really good example of how solid reasoning can win out over sophisticated modeling, which seemed at the onset to have a good explanation for some of the processes that Dr. Dasgupta's analysis has showed over the years about how discrimination occurs. A biological argument was proposed, and after some academic judo of the top sort, I think that was done very politely. I think it was a very, very strong case. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dr. Dasgupta to give us the 4th Doran lecture.
Well, I am totally amazed by Guy's introduction, because I could never have thought of all those things. I mean, it was not just very generous, but it was a lot of hard work that went into such a generous introduction. So thank you, Guy. I'd really like to thank the Doran lecture and the lecture series for inviting me. It's been, frankly, mind-boggling. I never thought I'd get to Jerusalem. I mean, wasn't somewhere where I expected to be. It reminds me of the first time I went to California, and I thought, this is where Cortez was. I'm standing where Cortez was. It's the same feeling coming here to Jerusalem. So thank you all very much. Really, this is quite something for me. And thank you, Lee, for taking a lot of trouble over this organization. Well, to tell you the truth, I'm slightly nervous about this talk, because I don't know how many of you have any interest in East Asia and South Asia. Is that better? Shall I just speak up? Is there something we can adjust here?
This is for recording.
Oh, I see. Try this now. Any better? Really? Okay, I'll just try to project a bit more.
Oh, that's better.
I don't know how long I can last, because I've had asthma. So just to give you an idea of what is this phenomenon we're talking about, for people who aren't necessarily familiar with East Asia and South Asian cultures, it's easy to give a talk to anybody from that region, because they immediately sort of click and they get excited and they start thinking and their mind starts working. But for other cultures, it just seems like another planet, which is very understandable. So what's the problem? The problem is that there's some parts of the world, rather large parts of the world, where there's a significant proportion of girls missing. And they're missing essentially because parents have much more incentive to raise sons than to raise daughters. So a lot of girls get aborted prenatally, and in the past, it used to happen obviously postnatally, either infanticide or slight delays in seeking medical care. The scale of the problem can be very large. At a national level right now in China, there's 20% of more boys than girls, has been for some decades. And it's not new. It was noticed already in the late 19th century in China by missionaries working there. And it was picked up by British administrators from the first Indian censuses, which were works of art, if anybody ever wants to look at those. And they picked this up and they puzzled over it, and they looked at, they said, is it possible that there's variation biologically between populations in sex ratios? And you know, they looked all over the world, and they looked at subpopulations in Europe and so on, and they found some variation, but nothing which would explain this. And they basically said, and then they did a lot of investigating, and they basically said it's a matter of infanticide. And in China, the missionaries said the same thing, it's a matter of infanticide. And this continued to be recorded in subsequent censuses. It was picked up in 1982 when China did its first major census after, well, they did one in 53, but 82 was the first major one that they did. And in their report, they brought this out. And again, they said it's essentially a case of infanticide or abandonment of girls, and we need to do something about it. It was viewed as a generic problem, that girls in general were less preferred than boys in general. But then doing field work in the late 70s and early 80s in Northwest India, what I noticed was that it wasn't a generic problem. It was part of a parental family building strategy. So the excess mortality was of girls, the second daughter or the third daughter. The excess mortality rose. Firstborn girls had more or less the same mortality as boys. And this was reflected elsewhere. It was found in Bangladesh, it was found in China. It was still a sort of a ho-hum sort of an issue. Then in the mid-80s, you got the advent of sex-selective technology, which gradually became accessible physically and financially. It spread. And the problem just exploded. Because obviously, if you can abort, it's not nice having to kill a child, right? But aborting a child is much less of a difficult thing to do. So the preference, the underlying preference manifested itself much more sharply than in the past, and especially because at that time there was rapid fertility decline. So people aren't going to have 5 children, they want 2 or 3. So the pressure to make sure that you have boys within that smaller space of 2 or 3 increases, and you've got this sex-selective technology. So the thing went through the roof and attracted a lot of attention. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the causes of this strong son preference, and then a little bit about the so what. What are the consequences? Right. So first, looking at the background, just looking for patterns, which regions manifest this female deficit? Where do we really find it? And what are the levels and trends in this female deficit in these regions where we do find it in East and South Asia? Then talk about the underlying causes of son preference in these regions. And then talk about what unravels these underlying causes over time. South Korea is a very nice example because they used to have, in fact, the highest level of discrimination of antenatal sex selection, and now it's almost normal. It changed very, very rapidly. And finally, talk about some of the consequences of missing girls. This is work with Avi, who's done a lot of work in this area on what difference it makes. For example, in China, if you don't have a one-child family policy, if you were to allow people to have 2 children or 3 children, how much difference would it make to this parental pressure to abort kids, girls? So this particular work with Avi was on the consequences of missing girls, of men facing old age without wives or children. So where is it found and what are the levels and trends? If you look around the world, basically more developed regions have child sex ratio. Child sex ratio is children under age 5. In more developed regions, it's about 105. And in less developed regions, excluding China, it's about 105. So what I've done in this table is just picked out those areas where they have 106 and above. And as you can see, Latin America and the Caribbean, there isn't a single country which has an unusually high sex ratio. The same is true of sub-Saharan Africa, with the possible exception of Mauritania. Similarly, North Africa, with the possible exception of Tunisia. West Asia, again, you don't find an abnormally high sex ratio. But there's these few countries, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, where recently evidence has been found of very high sex ratios. Nobody's sure what's going on. They're beginning to be sure that these are real and not some statistical artifact. But a lot of work needs to be done in this area. Southeastern Asia, again, nothing happening except for some overseas Chinese and Indian populations in Singapore. The action is in East Asia, primarily China, South Korea. Again, in South Central Asia, it's really India where you see this. Blowing up the map of India and China, the darker the shading, the higher the excess female child mortality. These are sex ratios of children aged 0 to 4 by province in China and by state in India. So what you see is these dark regions have 20% or above more boys than girls, northwest India. And then as the shading goes down, there's less and less sun preference until you hit Xinjiang and Tibet, and there's almost none. Similarly, the shading goes down until you hit eastern and southern India, where there's almost none. Also northeast India. So it's highly region specific. This parental strategy that I was telling you about, you see it in the Chinese data. If you look, this is from the 1990 census. The probability of the first child being a boy is absolutely normal. If the woman has only girls, she has a 56% higher probability of the next birth being a boy. And interestingly, if she has only boys, there's some small amount of preference for having children of both sexes. And it is not a new problem. Because the Chinese age reporting is so good, the age reporting is good because they have a system of lunar calendars multiplied by metals, which basically gives you 60 years. So if you were born in the year of the fire horse, you can be 0 years old or 60 years old. So it's very easy for census takers to know your age. So there's a lot of precision there. So what you see in China, if you project backwards from the censuses, is that during the internal civil wars in the 1920s, already the sex ratios were rising. Then the Japanese invaded and the sex ratios went through the roof. Then the communists came in, imposed gender equality very heavily, and they came back down. And there was only a slight blip for the famine, which was a huge famine, a major event. So it's a tribute to the power of communism's gender equality that that blip was so small. Then it went down again, and then with fertility decline, it went right back up to 1.2 today. I'll just move further. Looking at the trends in the sex ratio at birth, you see that China and South Korea both were in more or less the same position, but South Korea was a bit ahead, simply because it's a more affluent area, better access to sex-selective technology. And then China continued to rise, and South Korea, very interestingly, fell. On the subject of the year of the horse, it's not nice to be born in the year of the horse if you're a girl, because you'll be willful and nobody wants to marry you. So that's the year of the horse. That's what you get. You get a peak in sex ratios. But that's a digression. The interesting feature is the fact that it came down to pretty much normal in South Korea. So what are the underlying causes? I'm going to talk about family systems. essentially, there's three kinds of family system. There's the matrilineal, where you can inherit from the mother's side. Couples live with the mother's side. There are very few societies left with this system today. Then there's the bilateral system, where you can inherit from either side. You can live with either your father's, the husband's parents, or the wife's parents, or on your own as a nuclear family. And this generates very little distinction between the value of sons and daughters to their parents. It's found in many pre-modern societies, including much of Southeast Asia, and obviously it's very common in today's urbanizing world. Bilateral kinship systems are essentially the ones that you and I have, and virtually anybody living in the modern urban world has. And then finally, you can have the patrilineal system, where you inherit from the father's side. You would typically live with the father's side. And it's very common in pre-modern societies across Eurasia, literally across Eurasia and elsewhere. And these societies differ in how rigidly they exclude daughters, married daughters, from the parental home. Most of these societies across Eurasia had some possibility of women inheriting land from their parents, especially if they had no brothers. And certainly the possibility of remaining unmarried with your parents and looking after your parents in their old age if you stayed in the home. Elsewhere, in South India amongst Hindus and Muslims in general, they're patrilineal, but there's quite a lot of possibility of contact between married daughters and their parents after marriage. So you get son preference, but it's milder. People have documented son preference in pre-modern Germany and so on, but it's much milder. But a few of these societies rigidly exclude the scope for daughters to inherit from their parents or to help their parents. And this is essentially Han China, South Korea, and Northwest India. In their pre-modern versions, these societies were organized into lineages which controlled land. So you had access to land only through your membership of the lineage, which was only through the male line. And at marriage, a girl is transferred to another lineage. And so the children she bears becomes members of her husband's lineage. And she takes care of old people, but they're her husband's parents, not her own. And there's very little scope for adult daughters to help parents. And men are basically responsible for looking after their parents, not only their parents in their old age, but also their lineage ancestors, which is a huge burden, because you have to make sure that your ancestors are happy and well cared for in their afterlife, because if they're not, they can be very angry with you, and all kinds of terrible things can happen to you. And obviously, no pension plan cares for ancestors, so there's a huge pressure that the man has to care for them, and therefore there has to be a son. If you don't have a son, then there's going to be nobody to look after your ancestors. You're not passing the baton on to somebody, and the wrath of your ancestors can fall on you. There's a lot of nice stories coming out of South Korea on that in the ethnographies. But I'd like to tell you a little story. I was working with a woman from South India who lived in Delhi, which is in North India. And she was trying to help out some of her neighbors. And having helped them out, they then said that they now couldn't have tea in her house anymore because she was like a daughter to them. So you can't accept anything. She's sort of a bit of a catch-22 here. Anyway, so these societies generate strong son preference. Just to give you a sense of what it's like, in the Philippines, which is bilateral, the chances of your parents living with a married son or with a married daughter pretty much equal. But if you look at Taiwan, the chances of living with a married daughter, and this is Taiwan, already very developed, the chances are very low. You basically live with the sun or on your own. So to cut through a little bit to the bottom line, because this is a lot of anthropology, Han China, Northwest India, and South Korea, these lineages were much more than just a kinship system. By kinship system, we understand, who's your aunt and who's your uncle and who do you inherit from and so on. They were much more than that. There were systems for organizing administration, for administering law, justice, politics, and even military defense. So the aim was to strengthen the corporate unit for these purposes. And I'm going to give you a little bit of a sense of this. There's a huge number of ethnographies from China showing basically that, and South Korea. Some of these studies go back quite a while in terms of history. And what they show is that the state controlled people through the lineage organization. In China, apparently the lowest level of the imperial bureaucracy was the magistrate in the county. Below that, it was lineages, and they were responsible for making sure that their members towed the line in terms of the law, paid their taxes, and basically complied with imperial edicts. And if they didn't, there was a threat of collective punishment. So it wasn't just that individual who would be punished, but the lineage was incentivized to make sure that everybody within their lineage towed the line. There was various kinds of collective punishment. I mean, for something really terrible, you could have, several generations of your men killed. Most of the time, of course, something like that couldn't happen. But for example, for more minor offenses, you would have several generations of your men not allowed to take the exam for the civil service. What did the Chinese, the civil servants, what were they called? Mandarins. You couldn't take the exam because some uncle of yours had done something wrong, you would be barred from doing that. The same in South Korea. And the state incentivized people to form patrilineages and drop their various other systems that they may have of kinship. It was a conscious process of Neo-Confucian organization, and it was seen as a civilizing force and as a path for ethnic minorities to enter the mainstream Han fold and access its benefits. I've already talked about the supernatural beliefs. And this process of social engineering continued over centuries, from the Ming dynasty onwards in China and the Joseon dynasty onwards in Korea, which was about the same sort of period. Just to give you one snippet of the sort of incentives for non-Han to adopt Han kinship practices. So this is spreading out from the center to the periphery, and it's a process that's still ongoing. Xu and Liu did this study in the Pearl River Delta, and they show that segments of the local population converted themselves into legitimate members of the imperial order. They called themselves Han, they formed lineages, and they thereby distinguished themselves from indigenous populations in the area. And this gave them the legitimacy to acquire vast areas of land, to bar the other populations who hadn't had the sense to integrate themselves with the dominant Han group, and they became quite wealthy. And there's a lot of these accounts by a bunch of different historians and anthropologists. In northwest India, these patrilineal clans were very tightly organized in a cascading hierarchy of clan segments. So it's very easy to mobilize because, say, 4 villages would belong to one group, and then those would belong to a group of 20 villages, would belong to a group of 100-odd villages. So when an order comes from there that we're going to have military action, say, against the Mughal Empire, the word goes down, and then all these villages have to put men out and send them off to carry out whatever military action was decided at a higher level. They were highly organized for administrative, judicial, tax collection, and military purposes. And this is in place since at least the 13th century. A man called Pradhan did a very nice archival study of that. In East and South Asia, you get variations in sex ratios corresponding to variations in kinship systems. As you saw in China, the areas in the periphery have more normal child sex ratios. They're also the ones which have been slow, the process is continuing over centuries. They still haven't been fully integrated into the Han system. And anyway, the Han system is changing on its own now, so they possibly never will be. South Korea is a small and relatively small and homogeneous country. But interestingly, there's one little variation there where it's the eldest son, not any son, but the eldest son is responsible for all the lineage ancestors. And as you'll see later in the talk, they actually exhibit stronger son preference in family building. So what unravels this son preference? Basically, modernization, industrialization, and urbanization. I don't have to explain to you what modernization means, but the specific aspects of modernization, the role of the modern state, industrialization and urbanization, which play an important role in undermining the erstwhile rigid patrilineal. First of all, modern states have no use for lineages. They have very powerful tools of their own for managing their citizens. They don't need lineages to do that. Powerful tools for administration, tax collection, policing, military defense, commercial institutions based on impersonal rules rather than on kinship connections, modern communications tools. Moreover, they tend to view lineages as a threat to their authority. Mao tried very hard to smash them and succeeded to a very considerable extent. Similarly, the British colonial authorities were not very thrilled with the lineages of Northwest India, and they tried to undermine them slowly through the legal system. And after independence, the Indian government has tried to do the same. How do industrialization and urbanization diminish lineage power? Well, industrialization, can you hear me? I've stopped shouting. Oh, okay, thank you. Industrialization basically gives you the opportunity to access opportunities independent of your lineage status. It doesn't matter whether your uncle was a criminal. It doesn't matter whether your father has very little land for you to inherit. You can go out and get a job on the basis of your own qualifications. And urbanization is also very important. It reduces the power of the lineage to control individuals because you're living in an apartment block, you're working in an office. The chances that you're going to be surrounded by your lineage kin, as in a village, are very, very low. So they're not going to be able to notice what you're doing. They're not going to be able to control you so easily. And they're not in as good a position to pressure you to make sure that you have boys to continue the lineage. It also means that the chances that your son will be living near you are much lower because your son might go and work anywhere. I mean, Avi's disappeared into thin air as far as his parents are concerned. They're going to have to come here and find him, right? And similarly, the chances that your daughter might be living in the same city as you are no longer zero. So daughters or sons may be available to you in your old age. And of course, the exposure to new ideas through all these factors and through education. But a very interesting study by Jensen and Oster basically show that media can be very, basically prove, I mean, it's something that intuitively people have understood, that the media can accelerate social change quite effectively. What they show is that access to cable TV in India is associated with lower sun preference. Moving on, well, just very quickly, there's two different things that happen with development. First of all, sex selection can be intensified because it's easier to sex select with the technology, and there's greater pressure to sex select if you want a smaller family. But at the same time, you're undergoing all these normative changes that reduce sun preference. And at some point, the normative changes are going to overwhelm the ease of sun preference. And this is exactly what was happening in South Korea. You got the sharp rise in sex ratios with the sex-selective technology, while at the same time you see the change in social norms. So you see the sex ratios at birth rising sharply through 1994, while the proportion of women reporting that they must have a son was declining sharply through 1994. So you get the sort of two different effects. You get the ease of sex selection, increasing the manifestation. At the same time, you get the underlying norms have changed. And eventually that catches up, and you get this reduction in the sex ratios at birth, which is quite nice. So with a colleague, Woojin Chung, we looked at this. And we really found that it's something which it's a trend that swept the country very, very quickly. The odds of stating that you must have a son varied with the usual suspects, education and so on, if you pool the sample. But the year of survey was highly significant. So controlling for everything else, merely the fact that you are now in 2003 as opposed to 1991, the chances of your reporting that you absolutely must have a son is a lot lower. And here's your husband is the only son. There's a lot more pressure if there's nobody else to take charge of these people. Similarly, this is not a pooled sample anymore. This is just this is comparing the change in the odds of stating this between using 1991 as the basis, and you find that the rural areas caught up very quickly with the urban areas. So it's basically a change that swept across the country. And then Woojin did this Oaxaca blinder decomposition of the relative contribution of increases in education and urbanization with the changes in the social norms. And what you find that this was overwhelmingly important. So once a process starts, at least in a small homogeneous country like South Korea, it's very rapid. Obviously, in a large country like China, you can have change in some regions and not in others. Now moving on to some of the consequences, and this is the work with Avi. So, what happens when you get this bride shortage? What's going to happen to men who fail to marry? The problem, of course, is that China has had very high sex ratios at birth since the mid-1980s. And since 1999, the sex ratio at birth has been around 1.2. So you're getting large cohorts of people, of people where there's a very significant surplus of men. And so there's going to be a future rise in enforced bachelorhood, even if sex ratios were to normalize very soon. China is very different from South Korea in that, South Korea being a small place, they were able to import wives, small and rich. They were able to import wives from the Philippines, from Vietnam, and so on. China might be able to do a bit of that at the fringes, but the sheer numbers compared to the size of surrounding populations is such that there's not much scope for that. So what are the questions? Where will these single men be? These were the questions that Avi and I asked. where will they be located geographically? How much social assistance is there in place to help people who are single elderly? And what are the implications for elderly male poverty? Basically, the story in China is that if you look at successive censuses, you basically find the same story. Men who are more educated have a much higher chance of marrying, where the non-marriage is concentrated in the lowest education levels, whereas women are pretty much universally married regardless of their education level. In fact, if they're highly educated, they have a slightly lower chance of marrying. And this is essentially a problem of them being at the lower end of the socioeconomic group, their economic prospects being poorer. So who's able to attract women? If you look at female migration by prefecture, you find that they tend to migrate into areas where there's higher male education and higher sex selection. So there's a higher shortage of men, and there's more educated men, so they're in a better economic position. They're filling a vacuum. We find two routes of demographic subsidy. First, there's female marriage migration, which I was just talking about, from poorer to richer areas, and also in migration of less educated Han males to Western China, which is a sub-story. I'm not going to go into that. And our projections, which are based on the current distribution of male education, our projections are that the unmarried men will cluster in the poorer regions, which empirically you find already, the southwest and the northwest. Although interestingly, their sex ratios at birth, as you noticed, are often more balanced than the rest. So on the left-hand side, you see this figure that Avi had produced earlier, showing the darker areas where the sex ratios of children aged below 15. They're clustered in the central and coastal areas. But if you look where the shortage of women will be for marriage, the unmarried men will be concentrated in these areas. You're basically getting a transfer of women. They will cluster also amongst the poorest in these regions in rural areas. And rural areas, by definition in China, are poorer than in urban areas. Their social insurance systems are less strong, and their old age dependency ratios are projected to rise faster than urban areas, basically because younger workers are moving into urban areas, so you're getting a concentration of the old. And in some areas, you can have really high densities, like the national average is 20. You can easily have double that in some areas. This basically shows that unmarried men are poorer and sicker. It doesn't show causality. It may be that they're not married because they're poorer and sicker, but whatever this causality is, there's a clustering of being poorer and sicker amongst unmarried men. And social assistance programs in general in China have had very limited coverage, especially in poorer regions, essentially because they're funded from local fiscal sources. There's very little transfer between provinces in arrangements for social assistance. So poorer regions have fewer resources and much more call for support. So the rural elderly are highly dependent on family support. If you compare the urban age 60 and above with the rural age 60 and above, you can see family support is higher for them. Their pension income is very low. Urban workers have access to pension, rural workers do not, though the policy on that is beginning to change. And as they age, by the time they're 65, in their late 60s, they're already equally dependent on their own labor as well as family support, and after that, it's basically a question of family support. what you get in addition to this is a rising trend in the elderly living alone. If you look at people who were aged above 80 in the census of 2000, the chances of living with younger kin is only for 28% of never married people, compared with nearly 3/4 of those who have been ever married. So very few of these older never married people are able to live with kin. The patterns of kin support are changing. And obviously those with children still receive some support from them, even if they're not living with their children. They get remittances and so on. But the unmarried men have no wife or children to support them. And that's pretty important because it's not just remittances in old age. When you're younger and you're earning, if you break a leg, if your wife is able to earn, you can smooth out fluctuations in household income. If you're on your own, then you're basically stuck. If you're without wages for whatever period of time it takes you to get over your disability. So the chances of being pushed into destitution are higher. Arrangements for social assistance, I already discussed. So basically, to summarize, unmarried men will be concentrated where poorer regions means lower employment opportunities, lower wages, lower ability to earn to protect against working age shocks. It also means lower local fiscal capacity to provide social insurance. And as you saw, the single men will be self-selected amongst those with the lowest capacity to earn, to save, and the greatest vulnerability to risk. So to conclude, to conclude on the causes of sun preference, essentially these regions of China and the whole of South Korea and Northwest India manifest extreme sun preference because their pre-modern states used rigid patrilineal systems for administering their citizens. It was much more than a kinship system. You get an unraveling of that with the undermining of the lineage system, undermining with the advent of modern states, with the advent of industrialization and urbanization. But the consequences of sun preference, especially in China, in India, the consequences are quite strong in that one region, but it's a large country, so they're able to look elsewhere for brides. There's a possibility of evening it out. So given the overall sex ratio is 1.08, they still have some flexibility. But in China, it's much more widespread. So this is something that will play out over many decades, even if sex ratios at birth normalize very quickly. And meanwhile, what you'll get is a clustering of bachelorhood in certain pockets, which increases the potential for instability. And I guess the policy conclusion would be that you need stronger social protection programs and better fiscal redistribution between provinces to offset the potential for social instability. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We're going to take questions, and but first I wanted to thank Dr. Gupta for a very interesting talk with some uplifting news as well among some of the depressing statistics. Before I open up for questions, I did want to say thank you very much to Lee Caspi as well for organizing this. Thanks very much for doing a great job, and also Never Zoom is not here. Thank you very much. Okay, so please, yes.
Dr. Gupta, to what extent do you think that you'd actually see these patterns affect the age gap between grooms and brides? and whether relaxing demographic policies inside China may have maybe a solution that older grooms may marry younger brides, and as the generation, younger generation, cohorts are larger than the older cohorts, it could relax a bit some of the tension you're pointing out.
Shall I take it question by question? Can you hear me? Oh, okay. Yes. If you allow for stretching, both shrinking the age gap between husbands and wives, but also extending it, so men marrying older women sometimes. Not that there's going to be a whole lot of those available, but there might be the odd widow here or there. Mortality is very low in China. Men marrying into cohorts of women who are much younger than them. There's potential there for dissipating some of these effects, but at an aggregate level, you're sort of left. You're left with the same pattern unless your sex ratios start improving. If your sex ratios start improving, then you can marry into younger cohorts where there's going to be more women, so you're sort of mitigating some of those effects there. I don't know if Avi had something to add.
What's mostly responsible is the timing of the problem. So in other words, there's not enough women being born. So if people become more flexible, it's called demographic translation. So you can think about it. If you had men marrying 1 year younger, that's a whole new cohort of women that are on the tracks. But that means that the problem will be pushed back. So really, this is more of a timing thing rather than a fundamental thing. So the English after World War I were worried that they should let polygamy happen. There's so many men who died. But people were flexible. But in the Chinese context, it's not going to save the situation.
In your data, were the maps for Xinjiang and Tibet at the level more or less normal?
Mm-hmm.
And your argument is for the patrilineal or non-patrilineal society. In these two particular provinces, I mean, first of all, you have religious aspects in Tibetan Buddhism and Islam. And secondly, they are considered as minorities in the Chinese system, which is that they are officially allowed to have
Right.
as many children as they want. I'm wondering how much that impacted on the data.
I don't think they're allowed to have as many children as they want. How many are they allowed to have?
Usually it's 2 or 3.
Yeah. It's true that the family planning policy varies a lot. This is something Avi will know much more about. This varies across provinces. Ethnic minorities, as you said, are allowed to have more. In many provinces in rural areas, they're allowed to have more. And where it's tougher, sometimes the way it's relaxed is that if your first child is handicapped or a girl, then you're allowed to have a second one. So there's a lot of variation there. And indeed, what you say, the fact that in those minority areas they're allowed more children reduces the pressure to manifest a strong son preference. But you haven't seen that in past censuses there, and you don't see it today. So putting that together with what you see in the ethnographies in Tibet, apparently, it's acceptable for women to, be unmarried, have relationships with men, have a living relationship with a man, have children. These are things which are sort of total no-nos in mainstream culture. There's flexibility there, and they are allowed to be there. They're allowed to be semi-attached to their parental home. So it's sort of more like the sort of European type patrilineal, where you get a possibility of women being able to give something back to their parents, as well as to continue to receive from their parents in their adulthood. And Xinjiang seems to be mainstream Muslim. I mean, You get the endogamy, you get the continued contact between married daughters and that. So yes, both are there. There's the kinship thing, but also the fact that they're not under that much pressure to have a one-child family. You're the one who's done all the work on the variation on.
Two very quick questions, different types. One is, it seems between the ethnographic data and the census data, you're going back and forth between the units of study. Sometimes it's geographic and sometimes it's an ethnic group. And
Right.
how exactly do you decide which is the important unit in which situation? And the second, which is totally speculative, very often large numbers of unmarried men are associated, before you get the whole race picture, with crime and violence and all sorts of problems like that. Is there any research dealing with it?
Your first point is absolutely right. It would be much better if, if we could get away from looking just at the provincial level and look at it in terms of ethnic group. It's difficult to access the Chinese census in that detail. So you work with what you have. But if somebody were to do that, that would be much better nuanced. And your second question has already gone out of my head.
Large numbers of unmarried young.
Oh, with the crime and the violence. There was a book by De Boer and Hudson, or was it Hudson and De Boer, which basically said that, there's going to be mayhem in the streets. There may be. I mean, I think in a way, what we find in our study is a little saddening, because these are going to be people in sort of remote areas, poor areas, and they're sort of stuck away from the big cities and so on, where political voice is much easier to express. So it's possible that in these local areas you'll get high levels of rebellion and instability. It's also possible that you'll just have a lot of very sad old men dying out quietly. Hard to tell. The thing is that there's many sources of social instability currently in China. People don't like their land being taken away for industrial purposes without compensation. People don't like, there's all kinds of things going on which you're very familiar with. This could be an additional factor which sort of becomes an additive effect. It's hard to know how it will play out.
Is there any kind of societal benefit or sort of policy benefit which is coming out of these large numbers of unmarried miserable men? I mean, is there something which is sort of maybe unintended, but something which kind of would make this system sustainable over time because it's benefiting someone or some sort of interest in society?
Can't think of anybody who's benefiting offhand except, sorry, go ahead.
I would say that I think there is something to that in the sense that part of China's economic growth and their buying up American debt and all those kinds of things, it's kind of like they're living this bachelor existence where they're artificially wealthy and they're mortgaging some future which is eventually going to happen. In other words, the Chinese weren't accumulating assets, then later this generation would have a problem. I think there is something to that, but I don't know what the scales are yet. It's kind of like they have no children to raise now, and so there's high labor force productivity and participation rates, et cetera. Presumably that is not sustainable as they get old. It's part of the story.
Right, and if you don't have fiscal redistribution, then basically what the current policy is that you invest your savings and surplus into infrastructure, into various investments of different kinds, and you don't invest it into paying out pensions in rural areas.
A society of worker bees.
Sorry?
Sort of like a society of worker bees who have nothing but work in their life.
Right, and then you're expected to drop dead. I mean, the society isn't necessarily going to pay you back for the, but whether this is something that anybody actually wanted to happen, I find difficult to believe. And certainly, local parents pay a high price because there's a very interesting study by Wei and some Xiaoying, Zhao and Wei. Basically, they looked at Guizhou and they find where there's very high levels of non-marriage going on, and they find that parents are, doing everything to try and build more attractive houses so that they can show that they're rich, and they're selling their blood and sort of desperate strategies because it's a poor province. There's not many sources of income. But how can they attract a bride somehow? So they have to be able to compete with your next door neighbor by putting a second story on your house or making it look nicer, and so on. So yeah, it's certainly not working out for the parents who are not having the daughters.
Yes.
As I showed you, the communists were extraordinarily effective at imposing gender equality, and the same happened in North Korea. North Korea's sex ratios are pretty normal, unlike South Korea's sharp contrast. They've tried very hard ever since easing up on the sort of very tight control, ever since Deng Xiaoping. They've tried very hard in all kinds of ways to try and discourage this strong son preference. They've experimented with financial incentives to parents for raising girls. They've experimented with all kinds of things. They've banned sex-selective abortion. It's not easy to do because you can ban sex-selective abortion, but unless you impose collective punishment on a people, it's very hard to prove that a particular abortion was carried out for sex-selective reasons. Your abortion is legal and widely used. So they're trying pretty much as hard as they can. Sorry? Well, yeah, they don't have as much, they used to have much tighter control at the village level. They used to have women's federation people in each village whose job it was to make sure that, to monitor individual families. They don't have as much of that infrastructure anymore. It's opened up, it's loosened up. But they're trying very, very hard in all kinds of other ways, and probably succeeding. It takes time. It's not something that happens overnight.
Very convincing historical explanations about the Chinese case. I'm curious about Punjab and Haryana. And also I'm curious if there's any differences between Hindus and Sikhs in these regions. And also if you see any connections to the history, of course, of Sikh people in this area, developing such
it's very interesting because, well, after partition, there are no Muslims, for all practical purposes, left in Punjab and Haryana. They pretty much all moved. But the pre-partition censuses show that Sikhs were highest, Hindus are slightly lower, and Muslims are slightly lower. But all these people, and you know, if you compare Hindus there with Hindus elsewhere in India, or you compare Muslims there with Muslims elsewhere in India, it's a different planet altogether.
So ecology plays more than religion.
Right. Which is interesting.
I think we're going to stop there. Thank you very much, Ms. Gupta.